This is a map of Africa. It shows just how big the continent really is. Into Africa, you could fit China, India, the entire contiguous United States, and much of Europe. Africa is home to 1.2 billion of the world's citizens. It's a resource-rich melting pot of religions, ethnicities, cultures, and cuisines. It's a continent where natural beauty can literally take your breath away. It is also home to some of the world's most dangerous places, most intractable conflicts, and longest wars. Yet Africa still struggles to get time on the evening news or placement on the front pages of newspapers. When my next guest, Jeff Gettleman, became the New York Times' East Africa bureau chief, he changed that at least as much as one reporter at one paper could. The Pulitzer Prize winner Gettleman has held that post for the Times for 11 years, but he's been in love with the continent for many more. His new book is fittingly called Love, Africa. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Fareed.
So when people think of Africa, they think, the images I think are mostly still poverty and conflict. What do you think of when you think of Africa?
I think of some of that too. Unfortunately, the states in Africa are among the weakest, poorest states in the world, and that breeds all sorts of problems that we don't see anywhere else. Like famines, for instance. Where else in the world do we have a problem of famine in the 21st century? And Africa, unfortunately, that's happening right now. One of the bigger stories I covered was the Somali pirates. Everybody loved the pirates. They kind of represented modern-day outlaws. Where else do you have modern-day pirates to that extent, like in Africa? But there's so much more, and you kind of laid it out in your introduction. It is one of the most physically blessed parts of the world I've ever seen. There are so many places that look like nowhere else on earth. The pristine environment, the thick jungle, clear lakes and rivers, untouched. And at the same time, I think a lot of people don't appreciate what the spirit in Africa. And that's what really moved me as a young man and totally changed my life, was this idea that you could have some of the poorest people in the world who have so much less than most of us, and they were still so warm and open-hearted and connected with each other. And that was one of the things I took away from these early trips, was a sense of empathy. I showed up as like a clueless 18-year-old, and I wasn't really, I wasn't connected to other people, and I left different.
And you feel like that spirit of optimism in the face of extraordinary, kind of material hardship has actually increased, right? In the last 10 or 15 years, Africa is on the move in some ways.
It is. It's changed a lot. When I went there for the first time, it was incredibly different. I grew up from life at home. I grew up in suburban Chicago. And when I stepped off the plane in 1990 in Nairobi, it was unrecognizable to anything I had experienced. That gap is closing. So for instance, there's now Domino's Pizza and Burger King and lots of big American brands. And in a way, that's diluting the character. And some of the things we're exporting aren't necessarily the best aspects of our culture. But that gap between Africa and the rest of the world is closing. But it's still huge. If you look at lifespan and the number of kids who die from preventable diseases, I mean, it's something like almost 1 million African kids die every year from malaria, which is essentially a mosquito bite. And that doesn't happen anywhere else.
Let's look at one of the places you've covered really well, because it's a kind of intersection of many of these trends, and it's a way of getting, I think, the world interested, which is Somalia. Somalia is a place that is very poor, often very weak government, as you say, it even has pirates, but it also has radical Islam. And, explain to people, did you understand why radical Islam was able to spread into Somalia, spending time there?
That's a good question, because we have this knee-jerk reaction to these places, and we see them as a threat. But in Somalia, the world abandoned Somalia for many years. The U.S. tried to go in and help in the early 1990s. Then there was the Black Hawk Down incident, and then that left such a bad taste in our mouths that we didn't want to have anything to do with Somalia. And in those intervening years, this radical Islamic group came to power because they were the only ones kind of offering a vision. And people were starving for something, for some structure.
And they were offering stability, right? Al-Shabaab was able to actually in some way stabilize the place.
Very much so. And they used Islam. It was some of these, I met some of these Islamists in the early days, and they were quite open to meeting with American journalists, even to negotiating with the American government. And the U.S. government slammed the door in their face. But they were turning to Islam for a very practical reason, which was Somalia is divided between clans, and these clans have been tearing up the country and fighting with each other, and the Islamists said, let's figure out something that unifies us, and that's our religion.
What gives you hope about Africa?
I think the fact that people work really hard. I think the fact that that gap is closing with the rest of the world. And I think the world is more interconnected now than it's ever been. And the resources that, you know, there are special elements in our cell phones that come from Congo. And we're all connected now. Those guys are digging in these ditches, you know, for a few bucks a week. And they're producing something that we all need. And so I think that as time goes on, we will feel more connected. And we'll have a little more empathy. And Africa will become less of an other. And I think that's key, because for so many years there's been all these stereotypes going back to Heart of Darkness and so much that has been written. And that's what I kind of overcame. I was like, no, this is just a part of the world that I can feel close to and feel accepted in, even though I'm very different from it.
Jeffrey Kelman, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.